Realm presents The Triangle, Episode 10.
Michael Hammond ran as fast as he dared across the rough floor of the lagoon. It should be full of water by now, but the hydrofan's sudden surge of power had sucked it right out. The coral beneath his feet still glistened. It was absolute madness to come down here. If and when the hydrofan shut down, the water would come back with a vengeance. It said something that the Soviets hadn't ventured out of their submarine when the lagoon drained. They had to be curious. The long, slender periscope was up and spinning in a slow circle to surveil the basin. No help there. I guess it's all on me. He had the start of a plan, though it wasn't much. On her recordings, Dr. Brown had said that they made hydrofan runs of different durations at different times. That was essential to the experiment. That made hydrofan activity the dependent variable, which meant that it could be adjusted. Now I sound like Tessa. No, he couldn't think about her now. He rounded the corner of the lab building, but didn't slow at the alley that led to its door. They'd explored it once already, but seen no controls, and it hadn't felt like the control center. There was another building that had. It was smaller, square, and located immediately adjacent to where he'd first seen Sagara, St. Clair, and McBride in Soviet custody. In view of the submarine, to be sure, but more important, it lay almost exactly in the middle of the city and the lagoon, right where you'd want to be controlling things. There it was. He blew past the mouth of the alley, still no movement from the submarine to his right, and ran along the side of the smaller building. There was an alcove in the middle of this side, just as he'd hoped. In it was the entry hatch. He skidded to a halt in front of it. Shit! The round entry door matched the laboratory entrance perfectly, right down to the massive steel wheel. The same wheel that, on the other hatch, had taken two of them to wrench open. This was what he got for making half-assed plans on the fly. Well, it wasn't like he could run back and ask the others to come help him turn it. He grabbed the steel ring in both hands and pulled. Unsurprisingly, it barely registered his best effort, but he could have sworn it moved a fraction. Come on, baby. He crouched beneath the right side of the wheel, grabbed it low, bent his legs, and shoved upward. The metal of the spoke dug into his hands painfully, but the wheel moved. He found another grip and kept it turning before it lost all momentum. It still fought him, but less and less as it turned more. He kept at it, gritting his teeth against the insistent pain in his palm. Then the wheel clanged with finality, and the door shuddered with sudden freedom. He heaved it open enough to squeeze through. The air inside smelled stale and faintly metallic. It was dry, though, which was encouraging. He plunged into the twilit hallway as the boxy sodium lamps flickered to life. It opened into a broad chamber. Mechanical control panels and switches covered most of the walls, almost like the cockpit of an airplane, but larger. There are too many. No way he'd find the right control in time. As the lights warmed, he could make out the labels above each station. Radar, sonar, weather control, security. He scanned the others, fighting a wave of panic. Where is it? Then he spotted it. Hydrofan. He kicked aside an ancient leather and metal office chair and leaned over the controls. There were glass-enclosed analog gauges for pressure, voltage, water speed, and everything was over the red line. The water speed indicator had actually broken off. Not good. He'd have killed for some security footage of the island or the shore, but this facility was about 30 years too ancient for that. Damn. Still, with the gauges complaining, the situation out there clearly hadn't resolved itself. The throttle control lever was positioned halfway between off and maximum. He tried the lever, and it moved freely with a little effort. It can't be this easy. He got a grip and shoved it all the way down to off. Nothing. The needles in the gauge didn't so much as tremble. A small round light flickered on near the left side of the console at eye level and began flashing at about once per second. He scrubbed away the dust beneath it with his thumb and peered closely. Malfunction. Damn. He moved the lever back to the middle, and then made a quick, frantic search for some kind of emergency stop button on the console. No dice. Most of what he had thought were controls were actually status lights, like the one that helpfully told him there was a malfunction. The hydrofan lever was it. Son of a bitch! He slammed his fist on the steel counter. Maybe he'd have had better luck trying the power box, or even asking the Soviets to switch off their nuclear reactor. Then again, if that were a viable option, they'd have done it already. Dmitri couldn't be pleased about the load the crazy-ass hydrofan must be putting on his power system. The only other anomaly on the hydrofan console was a length of black cord that dangled loose among the buttons. Hammond pulled at it, which lifted something from the layer of dust on the floor. It was about the size of a credit card, but maybe a little thicker. Plastic, by the feel. The bottom had tiny square holes punched straight through it. He scrubbed off the top of it with his shirt, revealing 2 words in blocky black lettering. Chloe Brown. The size of it seemed familiar. Where had he seen it? Bottom left of the console. There was a rectangular metal plate with a horizontal slot. It looked to be the right size, too. He lined up the plastic card with it, took a breath, and pushed it in. There was a faint click, and 3 little lights came on above the slot. Holy shit! He found the hydrofan control lever again and pushed it downward. A long tone sounded. More lights flashed on the console. The faint hum from it faded to silence. The needles and the glass gauges were shifting left all the way to 0. He raised his hands up in celebration. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Finally, a stroke of luck. He turned and ran down the hallway and plunged outside. He shut the door and took off the way he'd come. Pure adrenaline drove him now. If the gauges were right, he'd just powered the hydrofan down. And while he wasn't an expert in marine science or anything, he was guessing that all the water that had been sucked out would be rushing headlong toward the island. He ran around the corner of the research lab, onto the open expanse between it and the rim of the lagoon. That was when he noticed the sound of distant thunder. It didn't roll like thunder, though. It grew steadily to a roar. He looked up in time to see the dark band of water rising over the edge of the lagoon. He skidded to a halt on the still damp coral. The water rose up impossibly high, 10, 20 feet above the rim of the lagoon, and facing him in a wide, inescapable semicircle, cutting him off. The sight of it paralyzed him. It crested the rim of the lagoon and crashed down, sweeping toward him, before his body finally conjured a basic survival response. Run. He turned and fled in among the buildings. The control building seemed like his best bet. He hadn't turned the lock wheel too tightly when he closed the door. He sped back down past the laboratory, hung a right, tried to ignore the thunder of the approaching water. He made a quick left, almost there. 20 yards, 10. Then a great weight slammed into his shoulders and swept him deeper into the city. The water swarmed around him. He tumbled end over end with the force of it and came up gasping. The wave carried him down between the buildings. He made a grab for the edge of one, but couldn't get a grip on the smooth surface. The force of the current was so strong. There was no escape. A wave slapped him in the face. The harsh salt of it gagged him. He sputtered, coughing, only to take more of it in. Another building loomed ahead. The tidal wave slammed into the side of it, rising up as the unyielding steel forced it left and right. It surged so high it almost reached the roof. Hammond caught a brief glimpse of it before the water pushed him under again. I'll have one shot at this. He surfaced again and wiped his eyes. The building loomed above. The water lifted him. He got his arms up and flailed desperately. His hands found the edge. He slammed painfully into the side of the building. The impact knocked the wind out of him. His vision went red. The water undulated beneath him. He didn't have the strength to pull himself up. His grip slipped from the edge. He gritted his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut, trying to keep hold. But it was no use. He knew it was only a matter of time, of seconds. Maybe it was better to let go, to have some control over his final moments. He took a calming breath. Then his collar went tight around his neck, choking him. Suddenly, he was moving upward. It surprised him so much he did let go. "Christ, grab on, I can't lift you by myself," Dumont said. He grappled for the edge again, found it. With her help, he managed to heave himself up until he could get his elbows on the edge of the roof. He got a leg up. Dumont hauled him over. They tumbled down in a heap on a metal rooftop. He felt like he should apologize, but laughed instead. She laughed too. "You really saved my ass," he said. "Someone had to." He laughed again, then leaned down and kissed her. Tessa Dumont still couldn't believe she'd plucked Hammond from the raging waters in the nick of time. The water level had continued to rise, so they took shelter in the building. It appeared to be a weather monitoring station of some kind. The hatch she'd used to access the roof opened into an observation deck. Inside, in the semi-darkness, lay a museum of meteorological instruments under a fine coating of dust. Anemometers, barometers, and even a rusted weather vane. The strangest item of all was a huge artillery gun in the middle of the room. There weren't any shells for it, at least that she could see, though 2 rows of circular impressions in the dust marked where the ammunition might have waited. Someone had removed them, and recently. The Soviets, if she had to guess. And that still didn't begin to answer the question of why this facility had artillery in the first place. She and Hammond didn't have a lot of time to poke around, regardless. The moment the water drained out of the city, they left the strange weather station and dragged themselves, still soaking wet, back to the shelter of the caves. They collapsed there to rest, intending to continue on to the beach. The next thing she knew, she'd woken the next morning in the glare of a relentless rising sun. It had never been this bright, this goddamn hot on the island since they'd arrived. Hammond was fast asleep, so she tiptoed out and hiked to the beach. It had been about 8 hours, as best she could tell, since Hammond had stopped the hydrofan. The beach seemed different now. She couldn't quite put her finger on how. Larger waves crashed against the sandy shores, and the wind blew strongly in her face. It felt like a normal beach, rather than the customary muted surf. Even as she watched, a pod of dolphins swam past, moving parallel to the beach, no more than 100 yards offshore. "Dumont!" St. Clair came sprinting down the beach so fast, Dumont looked behind her to see what was the matter. Instead, St. Clair wrapped her in a bear hug. God, she was strong. "Good morning to you, too," she rasped. "I thought you were dead." "What?" "You went running off to the lagoon, and there was just so much water. Where the hell have you been?" "I'm sorry," Dumont stammered. "I didn't realize." "What about Hammond?" "He's still asleep." "Thank God." Her face softened a little. "How in the world?" "She saved my ass, that's how," Hammond called, striding up to the beach. His eyes were bloodshot, but he smiled and hugged them both. "So much for being the hero, eh?" St. Clair elbowed him in the ribs. "Hey, I got the hydrofan shut down." "That was you." She gave him a double take. "I always knew you'd prove yourself useful one day." "Thanks," he said dryly. "Hey, is Malik all right?" "He is grounded," St. Clair said. "I have him searching the debris for anything useful." "If anyone can find something to salvage, it's him," Hammond said. "Hey, is it my imagination, or is the beach different?" "I was thinking the same thing," Dumont said. "I just saw dolphins. At high tide, no less." "The fog is gone too. It almost feels like a normal island," St. Clair said. A thought came unbidden to Dumont. "Where's the radio?" St. Clair pointed. "Over by the first aid kit? Why?" "If the fog is gone, maybe the electromagnetic interference is as well." "You think so?" Dumont chewed her lip. "Maybe." She jogged down the beach toward the cache that held most of their supplies. She hadn't quite made it when Sagara and McBride appeared, walking together up the beach with shoulders slumped. McBride spotted her first and gave a shout. Then they were running toward her, and it was more hugs, more reassurances. McBride couldn't stop laughing. Even the Vice Admiral wore a smile. "When the wave hit, we were afraid that you..." McBride trailed off rather than finish the thought. "How in the hell did you get out of there?" "We holed up in one of the buildings," she said. "Which one?" "It was some kind of meteorological station. Lots of old equipment." She turned to Sagara. "You wouldn't believe what else we found in there." "At this point, I believe just about anything," Sagara said. McBride barked a laugh. "I knew we'd win you over." "There was a massive piece of artillery," Dumont said. "Really? How large?" "Big and blocky. The barrel was narrow, but probably 15 feet long." "2 wheels or 4?" "4." He grunted. "That's an anti-aircraft gun. Skysweeper, probably. Was there any ammunition?" "There might have been." She formed her hands in the circle the size of the voids in the dust. "About this big?" Sagara pursed his lips and glanced toward the lagoon. "How many?" "0. Someone had taken them out." "Dimitri, it's what I'd have done." "I want to try the radio," Dumont said. "What for? Things are finally starting to get interesting around here," McBride said. "We should have enough battery left," Sagara said. "It's worth a shot." They unwrapped the radio from its plastic bag, grateful for St. Clair's foresight in waterproofing it, and flicked it on. A soft static came from the speaker, but it sounded different from last time. There was variation in the white noise, like a television closing in on a signal. Sagara looked at the display and pursed his lips. The bars looked good. He tuned it to 243.0, the military air distress frequency, and handed Dumont the headset. "All yours." Dumont took a moment. She'd gotten excited before, when they first acquired the antenna, only to feel the crushing disappointment of no answer. "How many souls are we up to? Counting Dimitri and his men?" "Leave them out of it for now," Sagara said. "All right." She supposed that would be a lot to explain anyway. 8 souls then." 7, he said. "What?" "I went to check on the last sailor from the Wasp. The tidal wave flattened his camp." He said this matter-of-factly, but Dumont knew it weighed on him. It would have been something, at least, to get the old man back to his family, even if it would be hard to explain how a touch of the slipstream had aged him 60 years. "I'm sorry," she said. 7 souls. "Well, here goes nothing." She held down the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." She gave the MLB's identification number and their approximate coordinates. 7 souls in need of rescue." She waited 10 seconds that felt like forever, then repeated the mayday. "Does anyone read us?" Only static answered. "Try 121.5, Sagara said. VHF guard frequency. That would have been her first choice anyway. Just as Dumont started to change frequency, the radio crackled. McBride gasped. "Go back!" She returned to 243.0. The radio crackled again. A man's voice broke through the static. "This is the US CDC, Yellowfin. Identify yourself." Dumont gasped. McBride gave a whoop of celebration, which brought St. Clair and Hammond running over. "This is Tessa Dumont of the NTSB, she said. The words felt funny after so long, but it was still how she thought of herself. "Captain Gregory Coe of the United States Coast Guard. It's wonderful to hear your voice, ma'am." Hammond and St. Clair heard that part and cheered. "Is Vice Admiral Sagara with you?" Coe asked. It miffed her a little, but she offered the handset to Sagara. He smiled and shook his head. "Go on, tell him. He's going to want to talk to you. Then make him ask." She pressed the button. "Affirmative." "Would you put him on, please?" She sighed and passed him the headset. "This is Sagara." "Captain Coe, sir. I've been instructed to ask you about your mission status." "Partial success." "Would you clarify, sir?" Sagara frowned. "Tell whoever's asking that if they want a damn explanation, they know where to find me." He gave their GPS coordinates. "Copy that, sir. Search and rescue is on the way." Dumont took the handset back. "We're getting rescued." That had been the goal from the start, but now it was happening. All of them looked at one another for a minute, sharing the moment. "I'll get Miller," Segarra said at last. "Where is she anyway?" Dumont asked. "Keeping an eye on things. Do you mind sitting by the radio?" "You know what? I'll do it," McBride said. Dumont looked up at him. "Really?" "Sure." He straightened with an air of self-importance. "About time I start pulling my weight around here. We can't let Hammond and Dumont be the only heroes." David Segarra climbed the short, steep hill to the ridge overlooking the lagoon. It lay empty now, it being just a couple hours into low tide. Miller stood leaning against the trunk of a tall palm tree. She possessed that rare ability to remain perfectly still for long periods of time. It was a useful skill for a sailor, particularly one who served as a sentry. She sensed his presence. He could tell that from a slight shift in her posture. He fought a tiny spike of irritation that he was breathing so hard after the climb. 20 years ago, hell, 10 years ago, he could have climbed up here and gotten within a stone's throw before she heard him. "We got through on the radio," he said. "Search and rescue should be here soon." Miller threw him a glance, but her face betrayed little emotion. "Hammond and Dumont? They survived." "I'm glad to hear that, sir." He joined her on top of the ridge, which offered a decent vantage point for the city and the lagoon, and, more important, the Soviet submarine. The tidal wave had dislodged the K-221 and moved it west about 50 meters. It was hard to tell if there was significant damage, but Dimitri's men had been working double shifts on the repairs. Miller had offered to keep an eye on things while he and McBride scoured the beach. "Any change?" he asked. "They disconnected their power cable from the city grid." "Are they still running patrols?" "Not that I saw, sir." "Good." He and Dimitri had reached something of an accord, but the more their two groups kept away from one another, the better the odds were of keeping it. "Everyone's accounted for?" "Except one," Miller said. "Who?" "The captain hiked out of the lagoon about half an hour ago." "Which way?" She pointed. "East. Following that lone power cable, right toward the hydrofan," Segarra finished for her. "I'd better go." He took the long way to avoid cutting through the city. The tide activity seemed to be back to normal, but no need to tempt fate. That made for a long hike around, almost 40 minutes, all the time wondering what Dimitri would be up to. The man hadn't left the lagoon as long as Segarra had known him. He found the Soviet captain alone on the beach, staring at the now inactive hydrofan. His rumpled uniform hung on him loosely. He turned, watching Segarra approach with drawn eyes. "You look like you've been to hell and back," Segarra said. Dimitri didn't quite smile. "When I look at this machine, I think I am still there." Segarra approached him and shook the other man's hand when he offered it. "You're alive, at least. How are your men?" "Some broken bones. One good sailor lost. But they are well for the most part. Yours?" "We lost one," Segarra said, thinking of the old sailor from the Wasp. But that would take too long to explain, so he changed the subject. "Any damage to the submarine?" This was a delicate question between two sea commanders. Dimitri's raised eyebrows said he knew it too, but he shrugged and answered, "Not nearly as much as we expected. It's a tough boat." "Yes." "Seaworthy again, I'm guessing," Segarra said. "Why are you suddenly curious about my submarine?" Segarra had worked out what he was going to say on the hike over, but now felt strangely reluctant. He pressed on. "Dimitri, we got our radio working again. A search and rescue team is on its way." Dimitri nodded and pressed his lips together. "In American rescue team. Yes. Did you tell them about us? You know what? I forgot. But when they arrive... He trailed off. When they arrive, you will be obligated to share what you know. I am not sure what my superiors would want to do with you, Sagara admitted. It might be easier for everyone involved if you go now, while you can. Go, you say. Dmitri met his eyes and looked back out to the ocean. Where could we go? How about home? Our home is no longer. You said it is 2019, that the Soviet Union is no more. The empire is gone. The people and places you knew are probably still there. I am not sure we have a place anymore. Sagara put a hand on the man's shoulder. The world needs good men, Dmitri. I promise you that. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps made them both turn. Olivia ran up and skidded to a halt in the sand. Guess what? We're getting rescued. Dmitri chuckled. So you heard the good news, Sagara said. She beamed. Not only that, but look at Mr. Babbitt. Sagara couldn't help but smile. He looks good. Very good, Dmitri said. Is he happier with his new eye? We both are. She shuffled her feet in the sand, suddenly uncertain. And a little scared? Of what? Sagara asked. Going home? He crouched down beside her and tried not to show his surprise when Dmitri did the same. Why does that scare you? I don't want to leave. He understood that. Leaving the island meant accepting that she was an orphan. We all have to leave, I'm afraid. This island is no place for a little girl, Dmitri said. But I just found a new fruit tree. I like it here. Sagara smiled. So do I. Michael says that there will be nice people who will try to find me a family. Is that true? If Michael says it, it's true, Sagara answered, and surprisingly, he believed it. My entire world is upside down. That doesn't sound so bad. Olivia bit her lip and seemed to think it over. Okay. I guess I'll just have to be brave. She scampered off, leaving the two men alone. She really has no family left? Dmitri asked. Not as far as we know, but there are foster families. You will look in on her, of course. Good. Dmitri gave a tight nod. If a little girl has the courage to go home, so do I. Attaboy. I'm glad to hear it. It's good the hydrophane gave out when it did. Otherwise, it might have destroyed the entire island. He frowned. I am surprised it's in such good condition after giving out. It didn't give out, Sagara said, hating himself for the necessity. We figured out how to shut it down. So it could work again. Yes. This thing you Americans have made, it wasn't me personally, you know, Sagara interjected. This thing other Americans have made. It is very bad. Worse than a nuclear bomb. He wasn't wrong, and it grated Sagara to admit it. A device like this, if strategically delivered near an enemy's ports, could change the face of naval warfare. Quiet, destructive, and self-shielding. God knew what would happen if such devices were deployed around the globe. That may be true. But I intend to make sure that it never gets weaponized. How can you do that? You said you were retired. A lot of good men and women still owe me favors. And like you said, it's too dangerous. No one wanted another arms race between world powers. Odds were Dimitri's men had given the hydrofan close inspection long before the investigation team crash-landed on the island. No country should have this technology. No country, Dimitri echoed. They shook hands, marking a silent promise to each other. Well, I suppose we should be on our way. Godspeed, Captain, Segarra said. He turned and headed to the camp to wait for the cavalry. The Americans were late. Marie St. Clair knew in her bones that this was not a good sign. It shouldn't take this long to mount a rescue party. Their own journey here was faster, and they'd been steaming more or less directly into a hurricane. She didn't know which was more frustrating, that they were late, or that she hadn't seen it coming. Our rescue from this rock relies on Americans. She sighed at the still empty horizon and stalked back to camp to check on Malik. All of the fire had left the older Zuiki brother after she took the gun from him. It had nothing to do with the fact that his unintentional sabotage had nearly destroyed the island. That was what she told herself. He slouched against a big piece of driftwood by the remnants of the campfire. Hammond and Dumont had finally given up on keeping it ablaze after they made radio contact. Are you thirsty? She asked. He shook his head faintly, but wouldn't look at her. She pressed a newly filled water bottle into his hand and used the big sister voice she'd perfected on her brothers. Drink, Malik. I'll be damned if I let you die of dehydration right before we're rescued. He looked at her, cheeks reddening, and opened the bottle. That's what I thought. She turned back to the water so he wouldn't see her smile, which was how she saw the helicopters. Well, it's about time. She shouted and waved at Miller and McBride, who were stashing the rest of their fresh water in the beach cache. They looked at her and she pointed. Miller gave a whoop and ran off down the beach, probably looking for the Vice Admiral. There were 5 helicopters, flying in a tight wedge formation no more than 30 meters above the waves. The sound of their engines grew to a roar as they approached. The 3 in front slowed as they approached the beach, where Miller and Segarra now stood waiting to meet them. The 2 others peeled away and flew past overhead. She had expected the bright orange and white Jayhawk choppers of the U.S. Coast Guard. These were a common sight in the Caribbean, and it stood to reason that they'd probably be the nearest available aircraft. But no. The helicopters that flew overhead were charcoal gray and bore no markings other than tail numbers. Blackhawks. She waved at them, even though it felt silly. Come on, she told Malik. He clambered to his feet and they both jogged out onto the beach. Hammond and Dumont arrived as well. The helicopters had touched down on the hot sand, still in a tight triangle formation. The pilots cut their engines, the noise of the engines faded. Segarra had advanced to meet the rescue party, whose apparent leader emerged from the middle chopper. Before she even reached him, St. Clair could hear the Vice Admiral's voice rising above the din. Because we've been stranded here, that's why. The leader of the rescue team was a white woman in a sharp gray business suit, backed by 2 men in dark suits and sunglasses. None of them were giving off a, we're from the government and we're here to help vibe. The woman had her hair pulled back in a bun so tight that it made her face taut. Or maybe it was always taut. She didn't flinch at Segarra's shouting, and she didn't smile. She asked a question in a low voice. St. Clair couldn't quite make it out. I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I'm not telling you shit until I talk to SecNav, Segarra said. St. Clair approached them, noting how the 2 guys in buzz cuts and dark suits stiffened. They hid their eyes behind dark sunglasses, but she could tell they thought she might be a threat. Good. What's the problem? She asked. Segarra and the woman broke off their mutual death stare and looked at her. Segarra gestured at her with barely hidden impatience. Marie St. Clair, Antiguan I know who she is, the woman said. And who are you? St. Clair shot back. Something about the woman's tone rankled her. The woman met her glare with a mask that might have been made of stone. You may call me Lydia. What took you so long to get here? As I was just telling the former Vice Admiral, The situation has changed since your group disappeared. When the Navy couldn't find you, my team took over the investigation. What team is that again? Sagara asked. I report directly to the Secretary of Defense. That's all you need to know. It also means you report to me. The hell it does. Seknav warned me you were stubborn. Lydia plucked a folded sheet of paper from a folder in front of her and held it out like a summons. The Vice Admiral snatched it, unfolded it, and read. St. Clair watched him for a reaction, rather than trying to read the document itself. An old detective's trick, that, and it paid off more than most people would guess. Sagara's curled lips smoothed out, and then his shoulders drooped. He handed the paper back with an air of near politeness. Only the set of his jaw betrayed his displeasure. Very well. He turned and brushed past St. Clair on his way back to the beach. Do as she says. She opened her mouth to tell Sagara exactly where he could shove his order, but he stopped and added, please. She let him go, and saved her glare for the Lydia woman instead. I might as well start with you, Detective Inspector St. Clair, Lydia said. Have I been promoted? Posthumously. The word hit her like a billy club to the solar plexus. Everyone thinks I'm dead. Her brothers and nieces and nephews. Fayard and her fellow police officers. How many days had passed since they left Water Island to chase those GPS coordinates? She knew what it was in island time, but not in the outside world. It could have been weeks, months even. How long have you been gone? Or how long did half the world search for you? She didn't want to know the answer to the first one. How long since they stopped looking? The Antiguan police are still looking for you, led by a young man. Foyer, I think his name was. Fayard. The other woman smirked. Right, Fayard. St. Clair wanted to kick herself. That was a classic interrogation technique, and she'd walked right into it. Now she knows where my buttons are. She schooled her face back to neutral. Fine. What is it you want to know? Everything, Lydia said. Sagara faced the dark-haired woman who called herself Lydia and tried to keep a civil tone. Because I checked the wreck myself, that's how. LHD-1. That's the hold number for the Wasp. They sat in the shade of the palm trees near the beach's shallow dunes, ostensibly so they could speak in private. The beefy men who'd come with her stood 20 yards away, sweating in their expensive suits. I'll have my people look, Lydia said. Suit yourself. If that's the ship, where are the crew? Your guess is as good as mine. She leaned back and lifted her chin at him. Are you refusing to cooperate, Vice Admiral? Of course not, he snapped. He might not have wanted to, but the letter of authority signed by the Seknav himself made it quite clear that he was to fall in line. He'd been a Vice Admiral a long time, but not so long he forgot how the chain of command worked. He tried another approach. I'm trying to help you avoid wasting time. The Wasp was doomed the moment it hit the slipstream. And that's this ocean current created by the machine in the water? It's more than just a current, but yes. He tried to explain this twice now, but felt like she didn't get it. He needed Hammond, but she'd insisted on talking to them all separately. Until we disabled it, the hydrofan created all kinds of hazards. The current, the fog, the electromagnetic interference, those are side effects, she interjected. What is the hydrofan's real purpose? You'd have to ask the people who built it. All we did was shut it down. Why do you assume this is an American facility? Look at the buildings. My men haven't found any buildings, or any structures other than your cave. Right. It was high tide. They probably didn't look for buildings underwater in the lagoon. Well, no need to tell her everything. Give it an hour. They're in the lagoon, aren't they? Practically an entire city. There's no doubting that it's an American installation. Especially once you listen to the audio reels, which her team had already found and confiscated from the cave. God knew what Hammond would tell her. What if I told you that there's no record of this research facility, or the supposed research program you claim was operating here? She made her tone casual, but she watched him like a hawk. There's no way you can know that for certain. Even I've heard whispers about Project Atlantis. Rumors. According to official records, that project never existed. Half of our weapons research programs don't have official records, he said. But he knew how uncertain it sounded. Something as ambitious as the Hydrofan and its accompanying city would have almost certainly left a paper trail. If we were involved in such a program, I'd know, she said. Then your security clearance is higher than mine. She didn't deny it, and he made another note in his mental file. He couldn't quite place her, but he'd figure it out eventually. She had the clout to get the SecNav's walking authority, but he'd never heard her name before. If Lydia was her real name. He didn't doubt that she was DOD, but it had to be a clandestine branch. The way she gave interrogations spoke to it. She'd been well trained somewhere, that was for damn sure. Training always told. I'll have more questions for you, she said. Can't wait. Heavy footsteps in the sand announced the approach of one of the suits. Both of them moved like Sherman tanks, steady but slow and ponderous. This one caught Lydia's attention and tapped his ear. She turned on her earpiece and listened a moment, then fixed her eyes on Sagara. When were you planning to tell me about the submarine? Inwardly, Sagara cursed. Dmitri was supposed to clear out before the rescuers arrived. But hell, he conceded that getting a massive nuclear submarine underway wasn't the same as firing up an outboard motor. All he could do now was buy the man time. Eventually. What the hell, Vice Admiral? They were here when we arrived. He gave her the background on the K-221, the Soviet crew, and how they'd been marooned here for years. A 60-second submarine, the kind he'd give to a group of superior officers. For the first time since he'd met her, Lydia didn't interrupt him. Then she asked, how much have they seen of the city? Probably more than we have. They've been here a long time. And they saw the Hydrofan. Of course. They helped us shut it down. What guarantee do we have that they don't have the plans and schematics to take back to Russia and help them build one of their own? Two things. First, they saw how unpredictable it was with their own eyes. Second, the captain and I have an agreement. Of what sort? That neither of us will permit our countries to make this into a weapon. That's not your call to make, Vice Admiral. I'm aware of that. But I know the people whose call it is. Trained half of them myself. She pursed her lips and didn't respond, but tilted her head slightly toward the side with the earpiece. Must be getting an update. She stood. Sit tight a minute. She stalked off toward the beach, took a radio from the guy in the suit and spoke into it. Something's wrong. Sagara stood, watching her body language, the set of her shoulders, the slight but definitive nod. Shit. He started toward her. He'd nearly made it when he heard the aircraft. Not the throbbing sound of a chopper, but the steady thrum of a jet engine. But the aircraft that shot overhead toward the deeper ocean wasn't a jet. The wings were too long and the body too thin. No cockpit. That meant a drone. An Avenger, and it was armed. He closed on Lydia so fast that she didn't see him coming. The man did, though, and put himself in the way. What are you doing? Sagara demanded. Stay out of this, Sagara, Lydia said. That's a nuclear submarine, he said, his voice rising. The guy in the suit wrapped him in arms that felt like tree trunks and held him fast. Lydia, Sagara shouted. Blood pounded in his ears. He wrenched himself around and squinted against the sunlight to track the drone's path. It soared low over the water, wings perfectly level, making contrails in the humid air. There. ignition beneath one wing, and a stubby black missile shot forward. He roared wordlessly, but it was too late. The analytical part of his brain knew that the longbow Hellfire was a fire-and-forget missile. Even if the drone self-destructed, it would continue on and find its target. He whispered a prayer that Dmitri had detected the incoming drone and dived as quick as he could, if he was still at periscope depth. The explosion sent a fountain of seawater into the air. The ground rumbled, and a wave of heated air hit Sagara like a shockwave. He tumbled backward to the hot sand. He closed his eyes and laid his head on the hard ground. Dmitri. When he didn't get up, Lydia's two henchmen let him be. They peeled off instead to intercept St. Clair, Hammond, Miller, and Dumont, who came flying onto the sand from 3 directions. "What was that? What happened? Was that one of ours?" Sagara found his feet slowly and painfully. He felt old. He ignored everyone but Lydia. In the name of God, why? She stared back at him with cold dispassion, then gave a shrug. They knew too much. Hammond kept hoping that all of this was a nightmare, that he'd pinch himself and wake up in a world where rescue came to pluck them out of this hellhole without interrogations and veiled threats. Even now, he stared at the Lydia woman as her words echoed in his head. They knew too much. He hadn't interacted much with the Soviets, but Sagara and St. Clair had. Their faces bore a mixture of shock and outrage. Hammond couldn't believe that the woman in the suit could be so heartless. He tried to break through to her in their brief interview, but she'd ignored all his questions about the rescue, the time passing, and the world outside. All she wanted to know was what he'd done and seen on the island since they'd arrived. Naturally, he told her about the tape recordings first. Sagara had fallen silent after his outburst. He and St. Clair looked at each other. Hammond took Dumont's hand and squeezed it. They were all thinking the same thing. What if we know too much? St. Clair approached Lydia. Is there a satellite phone I can use? I would like to contact Fayard. No, Lydia said. No, you don't have a phone, or no, I can't contact Fayard. St. Clair took another step toward Lydia. Miller eased closer to the Vice Admiral. They exchanged a subtle hand signal, so quick that Hammond wasn't even sure he saw it. This isn't good. Lydia put a finger to her ear and tilted her head to one side. Her brow crinkled with confusion. She said something in a low tone to her men. As one, they started walking toward the still idling helicopters. The 2 choppers that had been circling the island took up positions at either end of the beach, hovering, pointed out to sea. That was when Hammond saw the speedboat. It skipped across the gentle swell, heading for the island. 2 jet skis streamed out behind, zigzagging in its wake. Lydia shouted into a radio handset. Sink them, damn it! Radio crackled in reply. Hammond couldn't hear, but whatever was said clearly ticked her off. A second motorboat appeared, then almost a dozen more. No 2 were alike, and they zoomed back and forth with no apparent organization. Behind them, a massive motor yacht, one of those luxury liner jobs owned by millionaires, steamed steadily for the shoreline. There was even a sailboat, and for a brief moment, Hammond wondered if the Althouse had somehow escaped. But no, this yacht had a narrower shape and larger sails. Dumont pulled Hammond's hand, dragging him over towards Sagara and the others. What's happening? I have no idea, Sagara said. Who are they? Hammond asked. Sagara held out his hands. McBride sauntered up to the group. They are concerned citizens exercising their right to travel in international waters. The sailing yacht changed its tack to run with the wind, moving almost parallel to the shore. There was something printed in black letters on its rippling white mainsail. Hammond pointed. What does that say? They shaded their eyes. The sail went taut and the words came into focus. "The truth is out there." "You've got to be kidding me," Hammond said. "What does that mean?" St. Clair demanded. They all looked at McBride. "Friends of yours, I take it?" Zagara asked. "You might say that." "How?" "There are certain VHF radio frequencies where like-minded individuals can communicate freely." The first motorboat had come close enough to reveal a cockpit full of passengers, all of whom combed the shoreline with binoculars. One of them had a megaphone. His voice boomed across the water. "Where is Alistair McBride?" "Oh, hell," Zagara said. "Conspiracy theorists?" McBride clapped him on the shoulder. "You called your cavalry." He grinned. "I called mine." He walked out to the beach like the host of an evening party and raised both arms in greeting. This brought a flurry of activity in the boats. Several of them changed course and headed for the shore. The hovering chopper surged forward to meet them. It was like a game of chicken. The boats zoomed back and forth, looking for a way around to the beach. The helicopters loomed dangerously low over the water. Still more of them dotted the horizon. "You can't hold them off forever, Lydia," McBride called. "If anything happens, they have no one to blame but themselves. They're trespassing." "These are international waters. They have as much right to be here as you do. And when they arrive..." He chuckled. "Well, I've got lots of interesting things to tell them." "For all the good it will do," Lydia said. "A handful of people disappearing in a hurricane is one thing," McBride said. "How many people do you think you can erase?" The corner of her mouth twisted downward, as if she'd tasted something sour. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." "Oh, how charitable of you," McBride said. "I'll be less charitable if any of your followers set foot on the beach here. Got a radio?" She passed him her radio. He turned away so she couldn't see as he changed the frequency. Then he pressed the button. "This is Alistair McBride. For your own safety, don't try to land on the shore. I'll brief everyone in an hour. If it takes longer than that, you know what to do." "There won't be a need for that," Lydia said. "I trust you government types about as far as I can throw you," McBride said. "We've got an hour, so let's talk about those arrangements." The next 24 hours only served to remind Dumont that she really didn't understand people at all. One minute they stood on the island, still processing Lydia's incomprehensible decision to destroy the K-221. She still remembered Hammond squeezing her hand and the raw fear in his eyes. If the woman was willing to risk nuclear fallout to keep the island a secret, she wouldn't hesitate to remove a half-dozen people who were already presumed dead. Then, McBride's ragtag fleet appeared offshore, and suddenly the dynamic changed. Within half an hour, they were all safely aboard the helicopters and en route back to civilization. That word barely applied to Water Island, but compared to where they'd been, it felt like a 5-star hotel. The first thing Dumont did on arrival was take a long, hot shower. God, it felt good to be clean again. And to be still alive, of course, which hadn't been a sure thing. Granted, her family and her coworkers at the NTSB still thought her dead. She desperately wanted to contact them, but first, she wanted to sleep for a few days straight. Unfortunately, she didn't even get to do that. She was still drying her hair when a knock sounded at the door. She wrapped the towel around herself and yanked the door open, prepared to tell whoever it was to go away. Except it was him. Hammond. "Hi, oh, sorry," he said when he saw she only wore a towel. She reached out and felt his smooth cheeks. "You shaved?" "I regret it already. I was kind of getting used to the beard." She snorted. It wasn't really a beard, more like a fuzz. His mouth fell open in mock offense. "You said you didn't mind it." "It was scratchy. And it tickled when we..." She trailed off. The old Hammond would have blushed at this. Should have blushed and stammered something unintelligible. But this Hammond only smiled. When we did this, he pulled her against him and kissed her. She forgot all about the calls and the job and the uncorrected NTSB reports and put her arms around him. He pulled back at last, a little breathless. "They sent me to get you. We're all meeting in the command center." "When?" 5 minutes. She let her arms drop to his sides. "Oh, it's too bad." She sighed. "Yeah." She didn't even realize she'd wanted this until he showed up all showered and clean-shaven. He turned back to the door, but instead of leaving, pushed it closed. "Too bad it took me so long to find you." She laughed and kissed him again. Half an hour later, they made their way to the command center. Miller lingered outside the door, not quite guarding it, but not quite not guarding it. "We were about to send out a search party." "I'm glad you didn't," Dumont said. "Yeah, the search parties around here suck," Hammond added. Miller barked a laugh and moved aside to let them in. "Well, well," McBride said. "How nice of you to join us." "Did you get lost?" Segarra asked Hammond. Hammond grinned. "Sir, no, sir." "You both clean up very nice," St. Clair said. She wore a white police uniform, freshly pressed. Seeing it gave Dumont a little pang of sadness. This wasn't just a briefing, it was probably goodbye. "So do you." They took their chairs. Everyone had a manila folder in front of them with some papers inside it and a pen. Dumont thought about opening it, but decided she wasn't quite ready to know what lay within. "Let's get started," Segarra said. "As you've probably noticed, we're all still alive. And that's entirely thanks to McBride getting a message out to his fellow conspiracy nutcases." McBride held a hand over his heart. "Oh, Vice Admiral, you sure know how to give a man a honeyed compliment." "That was a compliment, McBride." "Please, you're making me blush." "Anyway," Segarra said. "Lydia also agreed to scrap the hydrofan and bury any research pointing to it. The city in the lagoon will be dismantled as well." "So they say." St. Clair crossed her arms. "How do we know these government people will keep their word?" McBride laughed and gave her a thumbs up. "We'll make a conspiracy theorist out of you yet." "I'm going back to the island next week to oversee the dismantling," Segarra said. "And I have the right to surprise inspections, which I intend to use every few months to keep them honest." He looked at St. Clair. "You're welcome to come along." She shook her head. "I have my own islands to worry about, and Malik to look after." Dumont drew in a breath. "He's going home with you?" "I have a big family already. What's one more?" "That's incredibly nice of you." St. Clair waved it off. "Islanders look after each other." Then she gave Segarra a sharp look. "Something you Americans would be well advised to remember." Segarra held up his hands, conceding the point. "What about Olivia?" Hammond asked. Dumont heard the emotion in his voice, and it pained her a little. They'd all grown fond of the little girl, but Hammond more than most. "Her parents are dead, as you know," Segarra said. "What about grandparents?" Hammond asked. "The father's parents are deceased. The mothers are living in a retirement community in Florida. I don't think they're a viable option." "Besides, they'd have a lot of questions," St. Clair said. "Her age and everything." "We're working with child services," Segarra said. "She'll be placed with a foster family." Dumont cringed. That poor little thing. "The foster system?" Hammond's tone indicated exactly how little he thought of it. "Is that really the best we can do for her?" "Not the regular foster system. There's a family in Savannah, Georgia. They have a daughter about a year older than Olivia, and they're military, so they know not to ask too many questions. I've already spoken to them." "So they're just some random people who want to adopt a girl?" Hammond's voice was getting louder. "No offense, Vice Admiral, but they're still total strangers. Do we know anything about them?" They're my son and daughter-in-law. Hammond already had his mouth open to retort, but caught himself. He cleared his throat. Oh, is that good enough for you? The old Hammond would fold here, Dumont couldn't help but thinking. He sat up straighter. Can I visit her every once in a while? I think everyone would like that, Segarra said. Hammond sagged a little, but nodded to himself. Dumont found his hand with hers and gave it a squeeze. He perked up. When do I get my audio rig back? Lydia's team had confiscated it, of course, along with the audio reels and the B&H reporter. Segarra pointed to a shipping container against the wall. Check that crate. It just came in. Hammond half fell out of his chair in his haste to rip open the crate. He dug in the styrofoam, then lifted a sealed package over his head victoriously. My baby! Dumont harumphed. Never thought I'd be jealous of electronics. McBride took advantage of the moment to chime in. Now is the part when we say, but Vice Admiral, this all sounds too good to be true. What's the catch? What is the catch? St. Clair asked. I was getting there, Segarra said dryly. Our freedom comes with strings. The first and foremost of which is a non-disclosure agreement. We can't share the details of what we found on the island with anyone without written authorization. Which no one will ever give, McBride said. Well, what are we supposed to say? Dumont asked. Our boat ran aground on a small deserted island, and that's where we've been. We got a radio working, and McBride called his friends for help. They arrived just after the Coast Guard. What about your friends? Dumont asked McBride. Did they buy this? They didn't at first, but I was very persuasive. But wait a minute, Hammond said. Doesn't an NDA make it hard for you to write your book? It was a valid question, Dumont had to admit. No one looked forward to revealing the secret behind the triangle more than McBride did. An unfortunate casualty of this deal, McBride said. But what can I say? He put one hand on St. Clair's shoulder and another on Segarra's. I like you guys too much to want to die with you. Christ almighty, Segarra whispered. But he didn't shake McBride's hand off his shoulder. What about our jobs? Dumont asked. It seemed like a callous question to ask now, but she really needed to know. The NTSB wasn't just a vocation for her, it was a career she'd spent most of her life working toward. This particular puzzle might be solved, but there would be others. My chief got word about the radio distress call, St. Clair said. He's already reinstated me. And the promotion? Dumont asked. I earned it. Good for her, but what about me? Dumont swallowed and looked at the Vice Admiral. The managing director of the NTSB already reached out through a mutual friend, he said. And? You can have just about any position you want, up to and including deputy director in the Office of Aviation Safety. She probably should have given more than 2 seconds consideration, but director positions were desk jobs. I belong in the field. Can I just have my old job? Consider it done. It was Hammond's turn, but she couldn't look at him, even though she could feel his eyes on her. What about you, Hammond? The Vice Admiral asked. Any plans? Nothing concrete. I think I can work again, that's what matters. But first... He trailed off. Dumont could feel his eyes again. This time she looked. What? Well, I'm thinking I'll take some time off. He grinned. You know, bum around. A warmth spread out, unbidden from her core. She tried to ignore it. Well, you are good at that. I'm good at a few things. She had to give him that. The most irritating part was that she could feel herself smiling. I think you'll be bored without something to do. He winked at her. I think I'll be just fine. Alistair McBride couldn't wait for his return to public life. He'd looked over the outfits in both Gucci suitcases and decided that none of them quite captured the feeling of secret triumph. But the lilac suit came closest, particularly when paired with his paisley purple vest, subtle with a hint of bold. Granted, it was hard to tell in this awful excuse for a bunk room. The sooner he got back to true civilization, day spas and fine dining establishments, the sooner he'd feel like himself again. He packed the rest of his outfits away and thought about adding the journal, but pocketed it instead. Some things are best kept close to the vest, he chortled. Hammond knocked on the edge of his open door. Hey, oh my God, what is that? The peak of fashion, Hammond. It's a crime to leave clothes like these in a suitcase. McBride made a slow turn so the kid could admire it. Hammond laughed. I'll take your word for it. Then his smile faded, and he seemed uncertain. Something on your mind? McBride prodded. The NDA. It just really sucks. Especially for you. I appreciate your sentiment. And it had stung to put his name on that document, knowing he couldn't immediately shout his breakthrough finding from the rooftops. It would have been delicious to make his critics eat crow on the world stage, but that would have to wait. On the bright side, I know the truth behind the triangle, and none of my competitors do. What are you going to do now? Find another way, McBride almost told him. But he was only 95% sure he could trust this kid. He'd probably run off and tell Dumont first thing, smitten as he was. I'm not sure yet. Hammond stepped inside and closed the door. Can I ask you something? McBride kept his face neutral. Of course. Does it seem strange that Lydia was willing to go so far to keep things a secret? I mean, we were lucky to survive and everything, but after that she's almost been accommodating. Never underestimate how far a government will go to keep its dirty laundry hidden. Hammond cracked a smile. I figured you'd say that. Still, I feel like we're missing something. I don't suppose they let you keep the tapes from the Atlantis project? Nope. And they wiped the copies from my hard drives, too. Damn. He supposed it was too much to hope for. I've got most of them restored already, though. I think they forgot that I work in data recovery. All right, McBride pumped a fist. This is huge, my boy. Well done. Don't tell anyone. Psh, who do you think you're talking to? He pondered a moment, then made a decision and plucked his journal out of his jacket pocket. All right, since we're sharing. Hammond gasped. You said you lost that in the tidal wave. I say a lot of things. And Lydia's men had a lot to learn about how to conduct a body search. He flipped it open to the middle, where he'd cut out a rectangular cavity that held a smaller leather-bound notebook. Have a look at this. Hammond took it and flipped through the pages with almost reverent care. It was Dr. Brown's journal. Holy shit, where did you find it? In the lab, the first day we went in there. He frowned. And you didn't think to share this? It's mostly personal stuff. He took the book back before Hammond could get comfortable with it and tucked it safely away. Except the bit where she mentions other test sites. Hammond's mouth fell open. Other Hydrofan test sites? That's what I'm hoping, McBride said. The NDA only covers what we found on the island, Hammond said slowly. Exactly. A most glorious loophole, and all things being equal, one of the reasons he'd been willing to sign it. If I locate another Hydrofan, I'll be able to break this thing wide open. Won't Lydia's people be watching you? The government's been watching me a long time, Hammond. So where do you think these other sites are? No idea. Oh. Hammond pursed his lips. Need any help? McBride grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Considering how well the island had been hidden, he'd probably need more than just Hammond before this thing was done. He didn't know how many test sites there were, or what paranormal mysteries they might explain. But he was going to find out.
You're listening to The Triangle, narrated by Neil Helligers. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm. Listen away. The Triangle is written by Dan Kobolt, Mary McGinnis, and Sylvia Spruck Wrigley. Executive produced by Molly Barton and Julian Yap. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.